On a hot and sticky morning in August of 1976, 44-year-old MrBallen Lokela woke up drenched in sweat. It was his first morning back in his remote village of Yambuku in the country of Zaire, and he didn't feel right. MrBallen was the school headmaster in a poor community that lacked basic necessities like phones, running water, and electricity. He could almost never afford the luxury of a real vacation, but he had spent the past 2 weeks traveling Zaire's rainforests. He'd visited friends and family and spent some time hunting rainforest game like monkeys, antelope, and Red River hogs. He'd had a great time, even though toward the end of the trip, he developed a persistent headache that developed into a fever. On the last morning, he woke up feeling shaky and nauseous, which made the long van ride back home absolutely awful. MrBallen had hoped that a good night's sleep in his own bed would help him feel better, but now, as he lay there staring up at the ceiling, he was feeling even worse. His stomach was churning and he felt a bit dizzy too. He could tell this fever was not about to go away on its own. He needed medication. The only medical care that was available was a local clinic that was staffed by Belgian nuns and a few villagers. There were no doctors, and the clinic was really just set up to provide prenatal care for pregnant women. But usually, the nuns did have enough medication to tend to the village's basic medical needs. So MrBallen dragged himself out of bed, careful not to disturb his sleeping wife. He fished a clean shirt out of his travel bag, and then made the long walk from his home down the dirt road all the way to the clinic. 20 minutes later, MrBallen felt weary from walking in the morning sun, but he could see the distinctive red metal roofs of the complex that housed the clinic just ahead. He felt grateful that these nuns from so far away had come to live in their village, especially today. He really needed their help. Once MrBallen had crossed the clinic's courtyard and stepped through the door, he felt a bit better. It was still cool inside, since the sun had not been up long enough to warm the building up yet. He looked down the row of beds, all kept impeccably tidy, and then he looked along one wall, and he saw a nurse was putting a few pill bottles into a row of beat-up supply cabinets. MrBallen knew this nurse. He was a local man who was named Sakado, who worked for the nuns. Sakado waved, and then asked MrBallen what brought him to the clinic that morning. MrBallen pointed at his head and said he'd been sick with a headache and fever for days. Sakado nodded sympathetically and asked MrBallen to have a seat in one of the little folding chairs by the door. One of the nuns would be over to talk to him shortly. As soon as MrBallen sat down, he closed his eyes and leaned his aching head back against the cool cement wall. He was lost in a daydream when he heard the click of footsteps on the clay tile floor, and then a soothing voice spoke his name. He opened his eyes to greet a short Belgian nun in a white linen dress. The nun pulled down the cotton face mask she was wearing and introduced herself as Sister Adela. She beckoned him over to one of the beds and told him he was welcome to lie down while she took his vitals, and so MrBallen happily obliged. After a quick exam, the nun told MrBallen that he probably had malaria, a disease carried by mosquitoes that runs rampant in much of Africa. It's usually characterized by fever and flu-like symptoms, just like MrBallen had. And so, Sister Adela moved over to the worn cabinets along the wall and pulled out a syringe that was full of clear liquid. She explained that the liquid was a medication called quinine, which treated malaria. Sister Adela gently stuck the needle into MrBallen's left arm and then pushed the medicine inside of him, and then she set the syringe aside and put a bit of cotton over the drop of blood from the needle. She told MrBallen to go home and take a nap, and he'd be back to normal in a couple of days. MrBallen thanked her, then slowly stood up and made his way out of the clinic. 8 days later, MrBallen's wife, Mbuzu, spooned some broth into a bowl and set it beside the bed she shared with her husband. She tied her long braids with a strip of leather and slipped into her shoes by the door. Her shoes looked miniature next to MrBallen's shoes. He towered over her when they stood side by side. But now, as he was curled up in bed, she thought he looked so small. MrBallen was still sick despite having gone to the clinic. In fact, after visiting the clinic, he came back and developed diarrhea and was vomiting so much that Mbuzu thought that he must be dangerously dehydrated. Her husband was so weak he couldn't even get out of bed. Mbuzu knew she needed to get her husband more help, so she told MrBallen she'd be right back, and she started walking to the clinic herself. When Mbuzu stepped into the clinic, she saw Sister Adela tending to a patient. Mbuzu waved her down and told her that her husband's symptoms had only gotten worse. She begged Sister Adela to please come home with her and see MrBallen. Sister Adela seemed alarmed that MrBallen was still sick, and so she agreed to go. Sister Adela told her mother superior that she'd be back in an hour. When the two women reached MrBallen's bedside, Mbuzu gasped. Her husband wasn't moving, and there was blood oozing from his eyes and ears. Mbuzu screamed and rushed to her husband. MrBallen opened his mouth like he was going to speak. Mbuzu leaned closer to hear whatever he was going to say, but then jumped back as a small river of blood gushed out of his mouth, trailing down his chin and staining their bedsheets. Horrified, Mbuzu turned to Sister Adela, who stared in disbelief. Then Mbuzu heard MrBallen begin to throw up, and so she grabbed a bucket just as he vomited up bile and blood. Mbuzu kept telling her husband that he'd be okay, but Sister Adela quietly shook her head. Mbuzu could tell by the nun's shell-shocked expression that she clearly had no idea what to do. Sister Adela just said she'd give him another injection of quinine, even though the last shot had done no good at all. After giving him the quinine injection, Sister Adela stayed a bit longer, helping Mbuzu clean up the blood dripping from her husband's eyes and ears. Once he was all cleaned up, Sister Adela told the couple that she promised to check in the next morning. But as she left, Mbuzu began to worry that tomorrow might be too late. A few days later, on September 7th, 1976, Mbuzu held her husband's hand as he took sharp, labored breaths. Sister Adela's quinine injections had not done anything. MrBallen was still unbelievably sick, his eyes had not stopped bleeding, and his saliva was red with blood. Mbuzu could hear blood gurgle in her husband's throat as he struggled to get air. She squeezed his hand helplessly until she heard her husband stop breathing. Suddenly, Mbuzu felt a terrible emptiness. Her husband was dead. She wrapped their bedsheet around MrBallen, letting her tears fall onto his motionless body. A few hours later, Mbuzu stooped over MrBallen's body alongside the women of MrBallen's family and some of Mbuzu's closest friends. Their front yard was full of neighbors and loved ones who came to sit with Mbuzu as she grieved. Despite her grief, Mbuzu felt touched by how many people mobilized to support her. Mbuzu and the other women washed MrBallen's body and wrapped him in a clean burial shroud. This was the funeral tradition in their village. Tomorrow, the men in the village would move MrBallen to the graveyard to be buried. A few days later, on the morning after MrBallen's funeral, Mbuzu awoke feeling totally exhausted. She'd barely eaten since her husband died, and she was completely worn out from crying. The moment she sat up, her head began to throb. She rubbed her temples trying to ease the pain, and then, without warning, she felt vomit surge in her throat. She barely had time to run outside before she threw up. Mbuzu knew this had to be more than just exhaustion. She cleaned herself up and then headed for the clinic right away. MrBallen's nurse friend, Sukato, had just finished sweeping the floor when Mbuzu appeared at the doorstep that morning. She looked awful. Even though the morning was still fairly cool, Sukato could see that Mbuzu was sweating profusely. Sukato felt a shiver run up his spine as he remembered the day that MrBallen had stumbled through the clinic doorway. He'd looked just as sick as Mbuzu looked now. He told Mbuzu to sit down, and then he ran out back to grab the nuns. Sukato came back inside with Sister Adela, and together they led Mbuzu to a bed. Sukato gave Mbuzu an encouraging smile, even though he feared she'd caught the same disease as MrBallen, which obviously killed MrBallen. And when his eyes met Mbuzu's, he could tell she was fearing the same thing. A few days later, in mid-September, Sukato was at work, busy refilling syringes with quinine, the malaria medicine. Behind him, Mbuzu's mother, sister, and daughter were all lying in clinic beds alongside Mbuzu. All of them were suffering from the same high fever and persistent headache. Mbuzu's mother had started hallucinating, especially at night. Sometimes, when she was sleepy and her fever was spiking, she'd say that her dead son-in-law was standing in the clinic. Other times, she would see shadows that were not there. Sukato felt certain that these women did not have malaria. For one thing, malaria is not contagious, so it made no sense that 4 women from the same family had gotten sick one after another. Then there was the way that Sister Adela had described MrBallen bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth before dying. Sakato had never seen malaria cause something like that. To Sakato, it seemed like this bleeding sickness was something new and that it was somehow spreading among families. Mbuzu and her relatives had not started bleeding yet, but if their illness progressed anything like MrBallen's had, it wouldn't be long until they did. The thought of an entire room full of patients all bleeding from their eyes horrified Sakato, and if their disease really was contagious, then he could be lying in bed among them by tomorrow bleeding out of his eyes. But then he looked across the room to a perfectly healthy pregnant woman who was resting in bed with an IV in her arm. She had come in for a routine checkup and prenatal vitamins. For this woman and everyone else in Yambuku, the little clinic was the only healthcare they had. It was literally the difference between life and death for countless villagers. Sakato knew that whatever the risk, he had to keep coming back to work. People were counting on him. Full of renewed purpose, Sakato finished filling the syringes of quinine and went to help his patients. A week later, just before sunrise, Sakato stood outside the clinic door with a growing sense of dread. More and more villagers were getting sick, all with the same horrible symptoms. 21 people had come to the clinic with this disease so far, and every single one of them had lingered in bed, unable to eat or drink, growing so weak that they could barely lift their heads, until finally, around the 10-day mark after getting sick, blood would start leaking from their ears and eyes. Some patients had red-stained teeth from all the blood pooling in their mouths. After that, it was only a matter of days before they died from blood loss. Almost all of the people who'd gotten sick had died. Mbuzu had lived, but she lost her entire family. At this point, only 4 patients remained alive in the clinic. And the outbreak was far from over. 2 days ago, one of the pregnant women who came for prenatal vitamins began bleeding. Sakato had tended to her himself, knowing that if the mother died, her baby would too. The stress was really weighing on him. Even from the clinic doorstep, he could already smell the sweat and sickness of the patients inside. But as scared as Sakato was about getting sick himself, he was not going to stop helping. He pulled his protective mask from his pocket and wrapped it around his face. Then he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As quietly as possible, Sakato moved down the row of beds, and by the far wall, the pregnant woman was lying on her side beneath the blanket. Sakato held his breath as he approached her, hoping she was still alive. But as he rounded her bed and crouched down, he could tell that she was not breathing. Sakato wanted to get a wet rag to clean her up a bit, but he knew that duty belonged to her family. So he just pulled the bedsheet up over her head and said a little prayer for everyone who remained in Yambuku. One morning a few days later, so in late September, Sakato sat by Sister Adela's bedside. The brave nun who had treated so many patients with the bleeding sickness now had the disease herself. And sadly, she was far from alone. 17 nuns lived at the mission, and 11 of them had fallen ill with this sickness. Sakato and Sister Adela had cared for them together, in addition to the patients still lying in the clinic across the courtyard. One by one, each of the 11 nuns had died except for Adela, who was barely clinging to life. The Mother Superior had been forced to close the clinic altogether, leaving this ravaged village with no one left to care for the sick and dying. Sakato's sick neighbors had started leaving Yambuku, searching for help in nearby villages. Nobody had returned alive. But it was no better in Yambuku. Sakato did the math and realized that so far, 90% of the people treated at their clinic for this bleeding sickness had died. Sakato pressed an aspirin into Sister Adela's shaky hand and then handed her a cup of water. The clinic had treated so many patients over the last month that they were down to their last aspirin, and this was it. Sister Adela thanked him with a hoarse voice, and he told her to please get some rest. Sakato left her room and walked down the long cement hallway that ran through the nuns' living quarters. For years, this had always been a very busy and bustling corridor, but now it was a ghost town. Sakato walked past empty room after empty room where the nuns used to live before the bleeding sickness had killed them. As Sakato neared the kitchen, he heard the crackle of static filtering in from the supply closet where the nuns kept their two-way radio. He peeked inside and found the Mother Superior turning dials as she tried to reach the outside world. She looked up at Sakado, and he was taken aback by the weariness in her face. She told him that all morning she'd been calling for help. She'd sent out radio signal after radio signal, hoping someone might hear and get word to the Red Cross or the Zairian government that they desperately needed help, but so far nobody had responded. Sakato felt a wave of dread wash over him as he listened to the Mother Superior's grim news. Over the past 6 weeks, they'd received no news from the outside world and no additional medical supplies. And now Sakato wondered how far the disease had really spread. Had it gone all the way across Africa? Was it all over the world? Was there anybody still left out there? Sakato needed fresh air. He stumbled out of the kitchen into the backyard behind the mission complex. Nearer to the tree line, there was a row of 11 white crosses marking the dead nuns' graves. Sakato had helped dig those graves. He imagined Sister Adela lying there on the edge of the jungle beneath her white cross, and now he wondered who would dig his grave when he eventually caught the sickness and died too. And then, almost like clockwork, a wave of nausea overtook him. Sakato hunched over and vomited on the ground, and when he looked down, his vomit was full of bile and blood. He had finally caught the bleeding sickness. About a week later, on the last day of September, Sakato was laying in bed staring at the ceiling. Because the clinic was shut down, he had just quarantined himself at home. Sakato had not left his bed for days, and he felt incredibly weak, but so far, he had not begun bleeding from the eyes or ears. He was determined to stay alive through sheer willpower. Just then, the ground beneath him began to shake, making the glass on his bedside table rattle. Sakato hoisted himself up onto his forearms to look out the window. He could see military vehicles making their way down the long dirt road that led into Yambuku. As Sakato watched in astonishment, the vehicles fanned out and surrounded his corner of the village. The soldier then spoke into the bullhorn and announced that Yambuku was now under quarantine. Nobody was leaving or coming back. Sakato was too weak, so he laid back down on his bed and just listened to the sound of the booming voice that was filling the air. The soldier continued and said that people in 50 surrounding villages were now also experiencing the bleeding sickness. Even people in the capital city of Kinshasa, 700 miles away, were showing symptoms. But the soldier said that the whole outbreak began right here in Yambuku. Sakato closed his eyes as the horror of their situation sank in. The disease was clearly spreading fast, and it was also clear that the government had no idea how to stop it. The people of Zaire needed help from the outside, but he couldn't imagine anyone would be brave enough to come to Zaire to fight this lethal sickness. A week later, a 27-year-old Belgian scientist named Peter Pio felt a rush of anticipation as he stepped off a plane onto an airstrip located 75 miles from Yambuku. It was a little more than a month after the first victim of the bleeding disease, Mabalo Lokela, had died. Peter was part of an international team of scientists and doctors sent to try to stop the disease before it spread beyond Zaire. Peter looked around the airstrip, taking in the lush green rainforest that hummed with plant and animal life. To him, it was the most beautiful landscape he'd ever seen. It was totally unlike anything in his native Belgium. Peter turned to help his teammates, who were all collecting their luggage from the belly of their little plane. Peter had to admit that he was not nearly as qualified for this assignment to go stop this disease as his teammates were. Peter had only recently graduated from medical school. However, he'd crammed in as much research as possible before he left Belgium. He learned about using protective equipment, taking samples in the field, and how to take and test blood samples. A few days earlier, the American Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, had confirmed that the bleeding disease plaguing Zaire was caused by a virus no one had ever seen before. Nobody knew where this virus came from or how to treat it, but they did know where they needed to start the investigation. Nearly 1/4 of the 300 or so cases across the entire country were reported in Yambuku. So Peter and his more experienced teammates knew that their journey would start right there. Peter was last to collect his bags from inside the plane. He told the pilot they were good to go, and the pilot shouted adieu as the plane took off. It occurred to Peter right away that in this part of Africa, people didn't really say adieu, they would say au revoir to say goodbye, which was French for see you again. But the pilot had just said adieu, which simply meant goodbye, as though he did not expect to see Peter or his colleagues ever again. Peter swallowed hard. There was no going back now, so he hoisted his bag up onto his shoulder and then followed the rest of his team off the airstrip toward a line of waiting Land Rovers. 4 hours later, from the back seat of a Land Rover, Peter saw a group of small wooden houses with thatched roofs in the distance. He knew that it had to be Yambuku. As they reached the center of the village, the Land Rover stopped. It took a moment for Peter to see why the drivers had pulled over. The road into the clinic compound was blocked. Hospital gauze was draped across the entrance to warn people to stay away. On a tree nearby, a sign had been nailed up. It read, quote, "Please stop. Anyone who crosses here may die," end quote. Peter could feel the mood in the Land Rover shift, as though the gravity of this situation was now truly sinking in. But nobody said a word, so Peter decided to take charge. He jumped out of the Land Rover, stepped over the gauze barricade, and began walking toward the clinic. As he approached, 3 nuns came rushing out, yelling at him to stop. But Peter kind of held up a hand, and he told the first nun that came up to him that they were doctors, and they were here to help figure out what was causing the bleeding sickness. Peter was touched by the look of utter relief on the nun's face. She said her name was Sister Marcella. She told Peter that for the past 2 weeks, the clinic had just been closed, and the remaining living nuns were simply praying for an end to this horror. She said that she and the others would do whatever she could to assist them, and motioned for Peter and the others to follow her inside the clinic. Peter carried his bag through the empty clinic and out into the courtyard. As the rest of the team got busy setting up a work camp, Peter asked Sister Marcella if they had any records of the patients who'd gotten sick from this disease and died. She nodded and promised to give him all her notes on the 70 victims from Yambuku, 63 of whom were now dead. Peter could hardly contain his shock. He'd known the disease was bad, but hearing the death toll out loud was staggering. 2 hours later, as the nuns cooked dinner, Peter and his team huddled around a table in the courtyard. Peter listened as the lead doctor explained their mission. The next morning, they would head out into the countryside looking for victims. They needed to talk to sick people and their families about when and where they got the disease, and then collect their blood for analysis. Peter was hoping that after a few days of interviews and testing samples, they could get an idea of how this disease was spreading. He felt energized again as he got up from the table and helped the nuns carry dinner out to his team. The next morning, Peter and 3 teammates drove west along a red dirt road on their way to visit nearby villages. Peter was struck again by how lush and green everything was. He loved listening to the sounds of insects and birds humming in the growing heat. It was easy to forget why he was there. But a reminder came soon enough when their Land Rover encountered a big pile of logs blocking the road about an hour west of Yambuku. The nuns had actually warned them about this. Most of these surrounding villages had blocked off their roads to keep out the people who had this bleeding sickness. The villagers had no supplies left to give out, and they obviously did not want to catch the sickness themselves. Peter wanted to respect their wishes, but it was vital for them to see what was going on in these other villages. So Peter and the rest of his team dragged the logs to the side of the road, then jumped back into the car and continued their journey. As the Land Rover made its way into the center of this village, people came out to see what was going on. Peter had expected the villagers to avoid them out of fear, so he was surprised when a few of the villagers gathered right around their car, looking very curious. The driver parked the car, and everybody piled out while the team leader went to speak with the village elders. Peter took a little piece of candy out of his pocket and handed it to one of the little boys who'd come to investigate. He noticed that none of the kids playing around the village seemed sick. He wondered if maybe the roadblock had worked. Perhaps it stopped the disease from reaching this village. Maybe there would be no blood samples to collect here, or survivors to talk to. That would be good news for the village, but a waste of a trip for Peter and his team. But then the team leader waved Peter over. He said one of the villagers had something to show them. So Peter grabbed his backpack from the Land Rover, and they followed this villager toward a nearby mud and clay home with a banana leaf roof. At the doorway, they all put on protective equipment, which included motorcycle goggles, gloves, paper face masks, and long sanitary gowns. Then they followed the villager into the modest home. It was cooler inside, but Peter's protective equipment still felt sweltering in the midday heat. Toward the back, Peter saw a husband and wife laying on a raffia mat on the floor. As Peter neared them, he could see they were so weak they could barely move. Dried blood coated their ears and their cheeks from where it had streamed out of their eyes. To Peter, it was like something out of a zombie film, and for a moment, he just froze. But then he remembered where he was and what he had to do. Peter took a syringe out of his backpack and knelt down next to the woman. He gently stuck the needle into her arm and filled a vial with her blood. The team leader knelt down on the other side of the raffia mat to take a sample from the man. Peter stood up and walked over to his backpack and pulled a little pouch from inside. He wrapped the vials of blood in plastic and stuck them into a baggie before putting the bag and the syringe into his backpack. And right as he did that, Peter turned around because his team leader gasped. It took Peter a moment to realize what had happened. The sick man on the floor had just died. Peter just stood there for a moment, totally frozen in surprise. Then he looked over at the dead man's wife, who looked like she didn't have long to live either. To Peter, it felt callous to leave her, and yet there was nothing they could do. They had no idea how to treat this new disease. In fact, the only way they could help was just to keep on moving. The villager who had led them into this hut ushered Peter and his team leader out of the home. As he walked them back to their car, the villager explained that soon that entire home would be full of women washing the man's body and preparing it for burial. It would be disrespectful for Peter and his teammate to be there anyway. So Peter, feeling relieved, thanked the man as he hopped into the Land Rover, and then they drove off to the next village. On the evening of the third day, Peter and his crew sat around their table in the clinic courtyard and compared notes. One thing they'd been noticing was that in many villages, more women seemed to get sick than men. And in Yambuku, a lot of pregnant women seemed to contract the sickness. But that wasn't enough information to actually draw any conclusions just yet. Strangely, the researchers had found that the village with the fewest bleeding sickness cases actually had no medical care at all. The village had only a traditional healer who handed out herbs and did healing rituals, but had almost no knowledge of modern medicine. And yet, his village was the only one they visited where nobody had died. The next day, Peter and his team leader went to that village where nobody had died yet to investigate further. When they arrived, the villagers brought them to their healer. As the team leader interviewed the healer, it occurred to Peter that the healer's home smelled strongly of bleach. He only noticed it because since landing in Zaire, he'd mostly smelled firewood, generator oil, and the jungle. So this chemical smell really stood out. Peter asked the healer why he was using so much bleach, and the healer just raised an eyebrow as though Peter had just asked him a totally ridiculous question. The healer pointed at a bunch of gadgets lying on top of a small table. Most were made of metal, and they looked like medical equipment, while others appeared to be homemade. The healer told Peter that those were his instruments, and he would use bleach and chlorine to sanitize them between clients. Once he said it, Peter almost felt dumb because the answer was so obvious. In the West, doctors used disinfectants to sterilize medical instruments, but in a place like this that was more remote, bleach was a decent substitute. Peter made a note of this in his journal. That evening, when they arrived back at the clinic in Yambuku, Peter followed Sister Marcella through the clinic, watching as she tidied up the space. He knew that she had seen this disease much more than they had, and so maybe she knew something that he and his team had not thought to ask about. Peter told her about the village with the local healer where nobody had died from the bleeding sickness. Sister Marcella said she actually was not surprised at all. She said the number of cases in Yambuku did not really start to rise quickly until the first patient, the school headmaster, had died. Peter stopped walking. The comment kind of struck him as odd. He asked Sister Marcella to explain what she meant. She turned and told Peter that, so far, the cases they'd seen had come in bursts. Every time there was a funeral, like clockwork, the next several cases of the bleeding sickness they would see would be people who had attended that funeral. It was like one big chain reaction. Peter thanked Marcella for the tour, and as he headed outside, his mind was racing. He and his teammates knew that this disease spread most easily to people closest to the sick, but they had not given much thought to the funerals themselves. Could it be that funerals were a breeding ground for this sickness? Marcella had said that it was usually close friends and family of the dead who got sick next, not all the other kind of random mourners who came to the funerals. So it wasn't just that funerals brought large groups of people close together. There had to be something about Zairian funerals that encouraged the spread amongst close family. Peter went to share this information with his team, determined to figure out what the cause might be. A few hours later, Peter sat around the courtyard table with his team, studying all the information they had collected from villages throughout the region. In every village they'd visited, the bleeding sickness had appeared in bursts, mostly affecting close friends and family of the deceased. And they noticed far more women were contracting the disease than men. Then there was another piece of information. In Yambuku, many pregnant women who visited the clinic later got sick. These pregnant women were just about the only ones to get the disease who had not recently been at a funeral for a close family member. Now, Peter and his team knew two things for certain. Something about these funerals was making people sick, and there was something unique about Yambuku that was giving the disease to pregnant women. Peter and his teammates talked into the night, but they just couldn't figure out what the connection was. It was like the explanation was staring them right in the face, but they just could not connect the dots. Peter rubbed his eyes, fighting off sleep. He did not want to give up and go to bed yet. So he stood and offered to make some coffee, and everyone agreed. Nobody was ready to call it a night. A few minutes later, Peter rummaged through the small kitchen in the nuns' living quarters, looking for the coffee. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the clinic's nurse, Sakato, carrying a tray of food. Peter had met Sakato several times and really liked him. Peter also knew that Sakato was one of the very lucky 10% of people to survive the bleeding sickness. So, to Peter, Sakato was like a walking miracle. Sakato also seemed to know just about everything, and he was always so eager to help. Peter asked Sakato if he wouldn't mind helping him find the coffee. Sakato smiled knowingly and then reached into one of the tall cabinets and pulled out a glass jar. That's when Peter had a thought. He asked Sakato to walk him through the procedure for when pregnant women came to the clinic for prenatal care. Sakato could do it in his sleep. He'd seen the nurses do it 1,000 times. He motioned for Peter to follow him into the clinic. There, Peter watched as Sakato walked to the counter in the back of the clinic and opened up one of the drawers. He withdrew 5 syringes and then told Peter that these were the 5 needles that they used to treat their patients: vitamin shots for expecting mothers and quinine shots for malaria patients. Sakato said they cleaned these needles every evening to keep them in good working order. As Sakato put the needles back in their drawer, Peter realized what Sakato had just said, that they were only cleaning the needles once a day. He blinked, trying not to seem too alarmed. He clarified with Sakato that the clinic used the same needles between pregnant women and bleeding sickness patients, and Sakato said yes, especially in the beginning when the nuns thought everybody just had malaria. Peter was dumbfounded. That meant healthy pregnant women who had come to the clinic to get a vitamin shot were likely being injected with tiny droplets of blood from people who had the bleeding sickness. No wonder so many pregnant women and their babies were dying in Yambuku. They were being directly injected with the disease by their nurses. The thought of it made Peter sick. Peter remembered the healer whose home smelled like bleach. He had been actually sterilizing his instruments between patients, and so that was why the bleeding sickness had not spread in his village. Now the wheels in Peter's brain were really turning. He thought back to the man who died right as they took his blood sample during the first week in Zaire. The villager who'd taken them there had said the women in the dead man's family had to wash his body for burial right away. And right then, Peter's eyes went wide as he had this sudden realization. He thanked Sakato and hurried right back out to the courtyard where his teammates were working, because he had a vital piece of information he needed to share with them. Peter and his team soon realized that the bleeding sickness was spread through contact with bodily fluids. In Zaire, part of the funeral custom was for the women in the family to wash the body of the deceased immediately after death. The virus was still very much alive on the dead body and spread when loved ones came into contact with bodily fluids such as blood. Meanwhile, the pregnant women in Yambuku were getting this disease from contaminated blood on the syringes used for their vitamin shots. As Peter and his team researched the disease further, they soon discovered that this lethal virus was originally confined to animals like chimpanzees and fruit bats. Mabalo Lokela, the school headmaster in Yambuku, and Patient Zero likely ate infected game on his hunting trip and became the first human victim. His wife Mbuzu and her family then caught the virus while preparing his body for burial. By the time Peter and his team learned how the bleeding sickness spread, nearly 300 people across Zaire and neighboring southern Sudan had died. But the spread was stopped thanks to the villagers' self-imposed quarantine and medical information being shared widely about the danger of sharing needles and touching bodily fluids. Peter and his teammates were tapped with naming this disease, and they decided to call it the Ebola virus after a river in the area. They thought about naming it Yambuku, but they didn't want to stigmatize the village. Since 1976, there have been more than 38 outbreaks of Ebola and over 15,000 deaths. Now, there is a vaccine for a particular strain of the Ebola virus, but as of today, there is still no cure. Before getting out of her car, 16-year-old high school junior Raina Ryson wrapped her boyfriend's navy blue Letterman jacket more tightly around her shoulders. Even if it hadn't been a chilly, cloudy day in the town of LaPorte, Indiana, Raina still would have worn the warm and oversized jacket, because this was 1993, and the fact that Matt Elser had given Raina this baseball-styled jacket with his name embroidered across the shoulder was a public declaration that the two of them were, once again, a couple, just as they had been, on and off, ever since Raina had been in the 7th grade. And even more important to Raina, wearing Matt's Letterman jacket gave her a feeling that most of her peers took for granted, a sense that she was safe and protected. Now, stepping out of her tan 1984 LTD Ford sedan into the high school parking lot, Raina gave herself just a few seconds to really savor the excitement and happiness she had been feeling all week long about the date that she and Matt had planned for tonight, Friday, March 26th. Turning to grab her backpack out of the car before shutting the driver's side door, Raina just felt thankful that after their latest breakup, she and Matt had both felt so lonely for one another, so incomplete without each other, that getting back together again was a mutual decision. As Raina looked around the busy parking lot and waved to a few of her friends and fellow members of the high school marching band, she thought about how right she and Matt were for each other. Both of them made accomplishments like getting grades good enough to consistently have their names listed on the school's honor roll look easy. With all of its emblems, Matt's jacket alone represented many of his accomplishments, like being a member of the school's track and basketball teams. But it was the treble clef note stitched on the chest across the school logo that showed one of the passions they both shared, and that was music. Although not even Matt could compete with Raina and her ability to play not just first oboe in the school band, but also the flute and the clarinet. Not that Raina planned to pursue music once she graduated from high school. As she had told Matt, along with her family, Raina's real dream in life was to become a veterinarian, which is why her part-time job at the local animal clinic was far and away her favorite of the 3 part-time jobs that took up so much of Raina's after-school life. Usually, on a Friday evening, it would be that 4 to 6 p.m. shift at Pine Lake Animal Hospital that would be one of the high points of the start of the weekend. But today, Raina knew that while she fed the animals and cleaned cages that afternoon, what she'd really be thinking about was dinner later that evening with Matt. A moment later, as Raina walked into LaPorte High School and headed for her locker, she was immediately lost in the crowd of students who were all spinning their combination locks and exchanging greetings with each other before the first bell of the day called them all into class. With her thick mane of curly brown hair, her blue jeans and sneakers, her average height and her average weight, Raina looked like any other high school student from any other solid middle-class family in this typical Midwestern town of about 20,000 residents. But in Raina's class, looks were deceiving, because Raina was different from most of the other girls in that loud and busy hallway. Behind that smile and behind that talent for telling jokes that made her friends laugh out loud, Raina had recently survived a profound physical and emotional trauma. Beginning when she was just 11 years old, Raina had become the victim of a sexually abusive relationship. The perpetrator was her then 24-year-old brother-in-law, the husband of Raina's then 20-year-old sister, Lori, and the father of the couple's two small children, Raina's beloved niece and nephew. Raymond McCarty's abuse continued until Raina was 13 years old. That's when Raina became pregnant, and not even her abuser's threats that he would kill her if she told anyone about what he was doing to her could force her to keep this terrible secret. Raina finally broke down and told her mother and father what had been going on during those so-called family visits to her sister's home across town. Raina's father, Ben Ryson, had been the one to tell Raina's sister, Lori, what had happened. Confronted by Ben, Raymond McCarty admitted that he had been having sex with Raina and agreed to turn himself into police. And in 1991, 2 years earlier, Raymond was convicted of a Class D felony for child molesting. A felony is the legal definition for a serious crime. Punishment can range from 1 year in prison to death. Class D is the least serious felony, a category that includes cruelty to animals, defacing a firearm, and aggravated assault. And instead of being ordered to serve time in prison, Raymond was given 2 years probation. Raymond's wife, Lori, stayed with Raymond, and Raina's parents also maintained ties with Raymond. In order to keep Raina safe, the family decided they would set their own internal restrictions to keep Raymond away from Raina. Now, 3 years after this traumatic experience, Raina's boyfriend, Matt, was one of just a few people outside the Ryson family who knew the details of Raina's abuse. Along with Matt in this small circle, there was also Raina's earlier boyfriend, a boy named Jason Tibbs, who Raina had, quote, dated, end quote, for about 6 months when both she and Jason were in the 6th grade. Given how young both Raina and Jason were, Raina's parents were relieved when the youngsters broke up and went back to just being very good friends. They were also pleased when Raina eventually settled her affections on Matt, who was just the kind of clean-cut, studious, and straight-arrow teenager that they felt would treat Raina well. Still, Raina had felt very relieved to be able to confide in both her friends, Jason as well as Matt, about a recent and unwelcome development in her life. Just several weeks earlier, Raymond McCarty had finished his probation sentence, which meant that as far as the courts were concerned, he'd served his time for having sexually abused Raina, and now he was free. And now that Raymond was free of the restrictions that the courts had placed on his behavior, it was up to the Ryson family to monitor Raymond's relationship and behavior towards Raina. Given how emotionally loaded this topic was for Raina's sister Lori and for Raina's parents, it was easier for Raina to tell Jason and Matt, rather than her own family, that it seemed to her that since Raymond's release from probation, her brother-in-law was once again making unwanted advances towards Raina. Standing in front of her school locker, Raina again pulled Matt's jacket close around her and reminded herself that she was strong and that she was loved. Even when Matt had asked for that recent break in their relationship, Raina had not fallen apart. She had said yes, and she had kept herself busy with her job tutoring a couple of middle school students, working at a local takeout restaurant, and best of all, working at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Still, Raina had been incredibly happy when she and Matt had both decided to get back together again. Now, tucking her school books under her arm, Raina looked down at her watch. She was so excited about this evening's special dinner with Matt that she was literally counting down the hours. At 6 p.m. sharp that Friday night, Raina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. In exactly 1 hour, Matt was supposed to pick her up at her house on 202 A Street, just 1.5 miles south of the animal clinic. Raina had already made a quick trip to the Rysons' neat 2-story home in the shady neighborhood where Raina lived with her parents and her younger sister Wendy. She'd stop there right after school, just long enough to grab a snack, change into her work jeans and sweatshirt, drop off her book bag, and say goodbye to her younger sister Wendy, who was headed out the door to go see a movie with some friends. Raina hadn't needed to tell her sister or parents how quickly she planned to get back to the house after her 4 to 6 p.m. shift that evening. Everyone already knew how much Raina and Matt were looking forward to their date that night, and how Raina would want to spend as much time as she could between 6 and 7 picking out what to wear and making sure she looked her best for when Matt arrived. But now, as Raina was getting ready to close up the animal clinic for the evening, she heard the door to the waiting room open, and right away, Raina's heart sank. Tightening her hands around the handle of the broom she was holding, Raina hoped it was not the same person who had paid her an unexpected visit earlier in the afternoon. Matt was too excited about the evening he had planned for Raina to wait until 7 p.m. Arriving early at the Ricin house at 202 A Street, he parked his car by the curb, looking up first at the lighted front porch, then down at his watch. But when 7 p.m. came and went, and Raina still had not opened her front door, Matt decided to drive to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, thinking that maybe Raina had to work late that evening. But when Matt arrived at the square one-story clinic 5 minutes later, there was no sign of Raina and no sign of her tan Ford LTD car. After making the loop again from the clinic to Raina's house and then back to the clinic, Matt drove back to 202 A Street, parked his car at the curb, walked up to the Ricin's front door, and knocked. A moment later, Raina's dad, Ben, was telling Matt that Raina still had not arrived home from work. When Ben invited Matt to come inside and wait for Raina there, Matt explained that Raina was not at the animal clinic either. In that moment, both Matt and Ben Ricin knew something had to be wrong. For the past week, all Raina had talked about was this date with Matt. If she hadn't been delayed by a work emergency, there was just no way Raina would have stood Matt up. And there was also no way that Raina would just hop into her car and drive off without a word to Matt or to her family. By 10:30 p.m. that night, Ben and his wife Karen Ricin arrived at the LaPorte police station to report their 16-year-old daughter missing. After being informed that police would not start searching for Raina until she had been missing for 24 hours, the Ricins returned home, and frustrated by the response they had just gotten from police, the Ricins contacted the LaPorte High School music director, and together, the three adults launched their own search. 12 hours later, on the morning of Saturday, March 27th, the town was plastered with flyers and posters showing pictures of Raina and letting people know that she was last seen at the animal clinic the night before. Raina was still missing, but now there were so many people, her family, her friends, her fellow band members, her neighbors, out looking for her that local police realized they could not just stand on the sidelines. So, by mid-morning, well before that 24-hour mark had passed, police issued their own call for information and tips about the missing 16-year-old, and by Saturday afternoon, there were state police helicopters flying low over LaPorte County, and police from other nearby areas had also joined the search. Almost immediately, the public appeal for information resulted in what police and the family believed might be an important lead. More than one witness had stepped forward to say they had seen two cars in the parking lot at the animal clinic around 6 p.m. on Friday night. In addition to Raina's car, there was another sedan, this one with two men inside and a teenage girl standing outside the car who appeared to be arguing with the person in the passenger seat. These bystanders had chalked up the scene to a possible teenage lover's quarrel until they saw the flyers that featured a missing teenage girl who fit the description of the girl they'd observed in the parking lot. Raina's father, Ben, had already given police his account of Raina's disappearance and mentioned Matt's presence at the Ricin family home the night Ben first asked police for their help. But in light of this tip that suggested Raina's disappearance might be connected to an argument or even a kidnapping that could involve more than one suspect who might have had contact with Raina just before she went missing, investigators got busy with formal interviews of Raina's family and friends. Detectives were especially interested in talking to Raina's boyfriend, Matt, asking him to give a more detailed account of exactly what he had been doing and where he was the night that Raina disappeared. But Matt's story was the same one Ben and Matt had both told on the night of Friday, March 26th. He arrived at Raina's house before 7 p.m. for their date. When Raina didn't show up, he made a few trips out to the animal hospital, where he saw no sign of Raina or her car, before he entered the Ricin house at about 7:15 to wait there with Raina's parents and sister for Raina to come home. But even before police had a chance to confirm Matt's story and his alibi, there was yet another very big development in what had become an official missing persons investigation. On Sunday morning, March 28th, so about 30 hours after Raina's disappearance, police reported finding Raina's car parked alongside a county road about 9 miles from her home. The hood was propped open, like the driver had been having car troubles, but police quickly determined that the scene had only been staged to appear that way. Not only did police find Raina's purse and car keys left inside of the 1984 tan Ford sedan, but when police turned on the engine, the car worked just fine. Then, even as crime scene techs were called to the scene to look for fingerprints and other potential evidence to explain what had happened, police found a ring, too large to fit Raina, in the glove compartment of the car. 7 days after Raina's disappearance, inquiries among Raina's friends about who the ring might belong to led police to Raina's former boyfriend and childhood friend, Jason Tibbs, one of the many people who had participated in the ongoing search for Raina. Jason was surprised but not worried when police showed him the ring they had found. He identified it right away as his ring and explained that he must have stowed it inside of the glove compartment of Raina's car when he had taken it off so he could fit his hand inside of a tight space while repairing Raina's car radio a few months ago. Jason also shrugged off Matt's suggestion to police that Jason was still romantically interested in Raina. Jason readily admitted to investigators that yes, he and Raina had dated briefly back in middle school before Raina and Matt had become a couple. But since then, Jason and Raina had just been friends, an account that was later confirmed by Raina's father, Ben, who remembered that Raina had asked Jason if he could help her with some small car repairs. Like Matt, Jason also had an alibi for the Friday night that Raina went missing. He'd spent that evening playing a popular game of car hide and seek with his friends. Called fox hunting, the game involved a driver parking their car somewhere in town, and then, using citizen band radios called CBs, the driver would give out clues that would eventually lead a winner to find the car and driver. And sure enough, police confirmed that Jason had given clues on and off throughout that evening to his fellow players via the citizen band radio. It wasn't until several days later that police made the discovery that would change the direction of the investigation into Raina's disappearance. That's when police discovered the Letterman jacket belonging to Matt Elser, the jacket that Raina wore or took with her everywhere in a wooded area that police had already searched several times since Raina's disappearance. Hanging 3 feet above the ground in the branches of a tree located in a wooded area 6 miles south of where Raina's car had been found, the sudden appearance of the jacket confirmed the growing suspicion that there was nothing voluntary about Raina's disappearance, and that someone had realized after Raina went missing that they had to get rid of a piece of important evidence that might link them to the missing teenager. Right away, police re-interviewed the owner of the jacket, Matt, but again, Matt's story was exactly the same, and everyone who knew Raina confirmed that whether Matt was with Raina or not, Raina was always wearing or carrying Matt's Letterman jacket with her. But it wouldn't be until 24 days later, on April 27, 1993, that the Ricin family received the phone call that they, and the rest of the close-knit town of LaPorte, had quietly been dreading. That was when a teenage daughter, whose dad was fishing at a county pond just 30 feet from a nearby road and 7 miles from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, discovered the submerged and badly decomposed body of a white female wearing clothes and jewelry that matched the physical description of Raina Ricin. 1 day later, an autopsy by the county coroner would confirm Raina's identity. The 3.5-hour examination would also reveal that the cause of Raina's death was strangulation. And suddenly, what had been a missing persons investigation was now officially a homicide investigation. With the recovery of their 16-year-old daughter's body, along with the terrible knowledge that she had been murdered, the Ricin family went from praying for Raina's safe return to praying that her killer would be brought to justice. And for the first time since Friday, March 26th, the Ricin family turned off their front and back porch lights that they had left on for 33 days, hoping to welcome home their beloved middle daughter. 3 days later, on May 1st, hundreds of people would attend the funeral service for one of LaPorte High School's most gifted musicians, and Raina, 1 week shy of her 17th birthday, would be buried by her family in a white casket trimmed with pink and covered with a blanket of flowers. Meanwhile, information that had been reported in the newspaper just days after Raina's disappearance, back when she was still considered missing and not murdered, now took on new significance and pointed investigators towards a new suspect, Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. Looking through old police reports, investigators had found the statement Raina had made back in 1991 that contained graphic details of the sexual abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law. And during yet another round of interviews with both Matt and Jason, both boys would tell police that since Raymond had completed his probationary sentence several weeks before Raina's disappearance, Raina had mentioned that Raymond, once again, seemed to be making sexual overtures. Now, with both Matt and Jason's alibis still holding up, investigators wondered if maybe Raymond might have killed Raina out of anger that she had reported the abuse that led to his conviction 2 years earlier, or that she had rejected and maybe threatened to go public with any new advances he may have made. Police suspicions were heightened when they discovered that Raina had had an argument with her sister, Lori, Raymond's wife, the week before Raina disappeared. And during that argument, Lori accused Raina of leading Raymond on. On April 30th, 1 day before Raina's funeral, and again on June 13th, police impounded both vehicles belonging to Raymond and Lori McCarty to search for any evidence that might link Raina's sister or brother-in-law to Raina's murder. Meanwhile, Raymond's account of where he was on the evening that Raina disappeared would keep changing. At the time of Raina's disappearance, Raymond told police he was out of the area at a friend's farm. But later, Raymond would tell police that he had given a female hitchhiker a ride that evening. Later still, Raymond would tell police that on the evening of Raina's disappearance, he was actually looking at a house for sale that was located just a few blocks from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. 17 months later, police formally identified Lori and Raymond as suspects in Raina's homicide. But before detectives could put together a case against these two suspects, police received a shocking tip that looked like it would send the homicide investigation in a completely different direction. In December of 1994, about 3 months after Lori and Raymond were named as suspects, LaPorte law enforcement got a call from police in Illinois who had arrested a man on kidnapping charges. Larry Hall, who would later become a notorious suspected serial killer, claimed that he had raped and murdered several young women, including Raina Ricin. Inside the man's van, police found newspaper articles about Raina's disappearance and murder, along with a bottle of birth control pills that had a crudely printed label on it with Raina's name. But it wouldn't take long for Larry Hall to recant that confession, and in the meantime, police had determined that the label on the pill bottle was a fake and that the suspect could not have killed Raina because he had been in Kentucky at the time of Raina's disappearance. 3.5 years later, with no other active leads, police had once again circled back to Raymond McCarty as their primary suspect. And in May of 1998, just over 5 years after Raina's disappearance and murder, police arrested Raymond and charged him with Raina's murder and locked him up in LaPorte County Jail pending a trial. But 15 months later, prosecutors decided that the evidence they had collected against Raymond was not strong enough to support a charge of murder. That evidence, found inside Raymond's vehicle and inside the McCarty house, consisted of several handguns, a stun gun, and bloodstains in his car that later turned out to belong to a deer that Ray had shot while he was out hunting. So, in August of 1999, 6 years and 4 months after Raina was murdered, Raymond McCarty was released from jail, and the investigation into Raina's death hit what looked like its final dead end. Once every year, a $200 scholarship in Raina's memory was still awarded to a member of the LaPorte High School band. No one had ever claimed the $36,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Raina's killer. And no one inside the community had come forward with any new revelation about what might have happened to Raina. And over the years, while the town of LaPorte never forgot that there might still be a killer in their midst, people's fear that the killer might strike again slowly faded into the distant past. It wasn't until the early summer of 2013, more than 20 years after Raina Rison was murdered, that police finally got the break in this case that they had been looking for. That's when detectives were able to act on a tip they had actually gotten 5 years earlier and do a formal interview with an eyewitness to Raina's murder. In exchange for a promise that they would not face any criminal charges, this eyewitness walked investigators through everything that happened on the night of March 26th, when 16-year-old Raina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Clinic and saw an Oldsmobile Buick parked in the lot outside the clinic door. The story police heard would change every single thing they thought they knew about Raina's murder. Based on that eyewitness account, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night that Raina Rison disappeared. As Raina's killer slipped into the front passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, they looked down at their watch and gave a nod of satisfaction. It was a foggy Friday night in LaPorte, Indiana, and the killer intended to kick off the weekend with a little visit to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Turning to the driver, who had borrowed this car from a friend, the killer gestured to the road ahead. Time to get going. A few minutes later, the driver and the killer had arrived at their destination. The killer looked first at the clock on the dashboard and then around the animal clinic parking lot to make sure it was empty, except for Raina's tan LTD Ford. Then the killer smiled. Perfect. There was still plenty of time before the clinic closed for the killer to get inside. And from the empty lot, the killer assumed that no one other than Raina was inside. Opening the passenger side door, the killer got out of the car and told the driver to wait while the killer went into the one-story square building located at 330 Pine Lake Avenue. Inside the clinic, Raina was doing what she always did at the end of her shift, sweeping the floor and tidying up. But hearing the front door into the clinic open, Raina suddenly froze. She'd already had one unexpected visitor that afternoon, and she hoped that whoever had just walked in this close to closing time was just there for business. But as soon as Raina saw who this new visitor was, her shoulders relaxed. Letting out a breath that she hadn't even realized she'd been holding, Raina pushed her hair back from her face as she stopped to lean on the handle of the broom. But after just a short conversation with her visitor, Raina's sense of relief had been replaced by frustration and annoyance. Having this discussion was not how Raina had planned to spend even a minute of her evening. It was now 6 p.m. and time to close the clinic, and all Raina wanted to do was head home so she could get ready for her date with Matt. But when Raina and her visitor walked out the front door together a few minutes later, the two of them had already started to argue. And when Raina had turned around after locking the front door of the clinic, she saw that parked right there in front of her in the lot was a car, engine running, and a driver in the front seat. By the time Raina and her killer had reached the Oldsmobile Buick, it was clear to Raina that her visitor was not going to be satisfied until the two of them had finished this conversation once and for all. So when Raina's killer gestured toward the car and asked Raina to just get in so they could drive around and talk, Raina looked down at her watch. She had a few minutes to spare, and better to just get this conversation over with here and now. So Raina agreed to the plan, on the condition that it really would be a short drive, because she had a date at 7 p.m. that evening that she was not about to miss. Just a moment later, Raina, wearing the Letterman jacket that she would later take off inside the car, had slipped into the back seat with her visitor. As soon as the driver heard the back door of the car shut, they checked the side and rear view mirror, put the car into gear, and pulled away from the clinic, heading east on Pine Lake Avenue. By the time the car had turned onto a heavily wooded section of North Vale Road, about 4 miles from the animal clinic, one or both of the passengers demanded that the driver stop the car. The argument in the back seat had gotten so loud that the driver was alarmed and immediately pulled over and turned off the engine. Looking up at the rearview mirror, the driver saw both passengers jump out of the car, then come into view again as they faced off on the deserted road, standing just behind the car's rear bumper. Their fight now was physical, and Raina was using every ounce of strength to protect herself. But a second later, the driver saw Raina's killer pull back their arm and deliver a savage punch directly into Raina's face. Scrambling out of the front seat, the driver made it around the side of the car just in time to see that Raina lay on the ground and that her attacker had straddled her body and wrapped their hands around Raina's neck. As the driver stood there, frozen, Raina's attacker leaned hard into Raina's neck, cutting off her supply of oxygen and literally squeezing the life out of her. Afterward, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then, standing up slowly and still breathing hard, Raina's killer gestured for the driver to open the trunk of the car. Together, the killer and the driver lifted Raina's body up off the road and dumped her into the trunk. Slamming the lid of the trunk shut, the driver and killer got back into the car and headed for the barn located a few miles away that belonged to the family of the person who owned the Oldsmobile Buick. Once inside the big open space of the pole barn, neither the killer nor the driver looked up at the rafters and saw 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds, the brother of the car's owner, sitting up in the loft getting high on a joint of marijuana. But that 14-year-old boy saw them, and when the two people below him popped open the trunk of the car and stared down at the body of a teenage girl with brown curly hair, dressed in blue jeans and sneakers, Ricky saw that too. And later that weekend, when 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds heard about the missing girl from LaPorte High School and saw her picture in the papers and on the news, he knew that the name of the girl in the trunk of the family's Oldsmobile Buick was Raina Rison. But on that cool Friday evening, all Ricky knew was that he better stay really, really quiet, because people who drove around with a dead body in their car were dangerous. Ricky was relieved when the car's driver and passenger finally stopped arguing, hopped back in the Buick, turned on the engine, and then reversed out of the barn. But even after the sound of the car tires rolling across gravel had faded, Ricky stayed where he was, holding the smoke from the joint inside his lungs. If he told anyone about what he had seen, maybe those two people would come back and kill him too. Or maybe he'd get in trouble for smoking marijuana. Either way, the 14-year-old boy decided not to say anything at all. Breathing the smoke out through his nose, he tried to enjoy the last few puffs on his joint, but it wasn't any use. The buzz he'd been feeling before the car had rolled into the pole barn was as dead as the girl with the white face, all the color drained right out of her. Meanwhile, the Buick's driver had dropped Raina's killer back off at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital to pick up Raina's tan Ford sedan. Holding Raina's purse and car keys, the killer hopped behind the wheel of Raina's car, started up the engine, and then, one behind the other, the cars headed in the direction of a small county pond about 7 miles away. Once they were close enough to their destination that they could see the water about 30 feet from the road, the cars pulled to a stop. A few minutes later, the driver of the Buick, along with Raina's killer, had dragged Raina's body out of the trunk. After dumping Raina face down in the weeds and muck at the edge of the pond, the driver and killer grabbed 2 nearby logs and pulled them on top of Raina's body until she was fully submerged. The driver and killer wiped off their hands and got back into their cars. A few minutes later, they came to a stop along County Road 200E, 5 miles northwest of LaPorte. After parking Raina's car on the shoulder of the road, Raina's killer propped open the hood so the car looked disabled and abandoned. Then, hopping back into the passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, the killer rolled the car window partway down, leaned back, and sucked in big mouthfuls of the chill night air. Pulling away from the side of the road, the driver turned the car south. A few minutes later, the driver of the car dropped the killer off at the killer's house and then returned the car he had been driving that night to the pole barn. Even if the driver of the car had known to look, by then, 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds was nowhere in sight. Later that same night, the killer would return to the pole barn to pick up the Letterman jacket that Raina had left in the back seat of the Buick. And a day or two later, and Raina's killer would drive to the same secluded area where the killer had strangled Raina, and the killer would throw the jacket as far as they could into the woods, hoping that if the jacket was ever found, it would lead police to Raina's boyfriend, Matt Elser. 15 years later, in 2008, Ricky Hammonds decided it was time to tell police what he saw in the pole barn the night that Raina Rison was murdered, and give the police the names of the 2 people he believed killed her. By then, Ricky's own life had gone off the rails, and the now 29-year-old Ricky was serving a 44-year-long prison sentence for a murder that he had committed 10 years earlier. But Ricky wasn't looking for any personal benefit in exchange for talking with state police. According to Ricky, now that he had nieces of his own, he just wanted the Ricin family to know what happened to their 16-year-old daughter. But even though Ricky's account of what he saw that night in the barn seemed very credible, it would take another 5 years before Indiana state prosecutors would offer immunity to the driver of the Oldsmobile Buick in exchange for testifying against Raina's killer. That driver was a man named Eric Freeman, who, at the time of Raina's death, was the boyfriend of the car's owner, Ricky's older sister. And in June of 2013, after more than 20 years of chasing hundreds of dead ends, investigators sat down with Eric Freeman and finally confirmed the identity of Raina's killer, her one-time boyfriend in middle school and one of the few people Raina had entrusted with her secrets and her friendship, Jason Tibbs, who was 16 years old at the time of her murder. It would turn out, starting back in the 6th grade, Jason had developed such strong feelings for Raina that even after their 6-month preteen romance ended, Jason had never given up on, quote, getting Raina back, end quote. Instead, in the years after their breakup, Jason had always kept in touch with Raina. He sent her love letters that police and Raina's family had found among Raina's belongings. Jason helped Raina with small car repairs, and Jason was outraged by the abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law, Raymond. And according to Jason's friend, Eric Freeman, on March 26, 1993, Jason had asked Eric to drive him to Pine Lake Animal Hospital, where Raina worked, so when Raina got off her shift at 6 p.m., Jason could talk with her again about the two of them maybe getting back together. But even before Raina agreed to get into the car with Jason and Eric told investigators that it was clear from Raina and Jason's argument that Raina, quote, just didn't want to be with Jason Tibbs, end quote. Freeman told police that during that drive, the couple's argument got so loud that Eric told them he wanted to leave, and Eric felt relieved when they told him to stop, and then both Raina and Jason got out of the car, but Eric said he never suspected that Jason was about to kill Raina. Afterward, when Eric and Jason arrived at the pole barn that belonged to the family of Eric's girlfriend, neither teenager noticed 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds up in the rafters smoking a joint. But when Eric stood next to Jason, looking down at Raina's body in the open trunk of the Buick, and asked Jason why he'd killed her, both Eric and Ricky heard and remembered Jason's answer. Quote, "If I can't have her, nobody can," end quote. As for Jason's alibi, that he was out fox hunting in his car with friends, police would discover that while players may have heard Jason's voice on their CB radios that night, no one actually saw him and could confirm his physical whereabouts. As for Raina's earlier visitor at the animal hospital on the afternoon of March 26th, that was her brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. It was Raymond's sexual abuse of Raina, coupled with his eventual admission that on the afternoon Raina had disappeared, he had gone from looking at that house for sale directly to the animal clinic to visit Raina, that would make Raymond the prime suspect in Raina's murder and help lead to his wrongful arrest back in 1998. On August 23, 2013, 20 years and 5 months after Raina Ricin was strangled to death, 37-year-old Jason Tibbs, who was married with children and still living in LaPorte County, Indiana, was arrested and charged with Raina Ricin's murder. On November 7, 2014, Jason was found guilty. 1 month later, Jason Tibbs was sentenced to the state minimum for a murder committed in 1993, 40 years in prison, but with 20 years of that sentence already served. Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty, would die in February 2018 at the age of 52 from a self-inflicted wound. At the time of his death, Raymond McCarty was in jail, having been arrested 3 days earlier on a charge of battery resulting in serious bodily injury. The inscription on Raina Ricin's headstone reads, quote, "She now plays a flute of silver and an oboe of gold," end quote. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. Again, the YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time.